ancestors in the Great Land in the east. Whenever they undertook this long voyage, they took two totem birds with them, Titi and Kaka. Together they give the name to another homeland of the gods, Titicaca, the location of the temple city of Tiwanaku. In order to understand ancient places, it is useful to turn to etymology, particularly the earliest iterations of a name, because it often reveals a true meaning, a purpose, or an event. And in the Altiplano of Bolivia, the oldest languages are Puquina and Aymara. And the syllables Tiwanaku mean my people. Except that the syllable Aku is not Aymara, it is Egyptian, and it means shining being. So Tiwanaku becomes the place of my shining people. We'll return to them in a moment. Tiwanaku is composed of 6 known temples covering 2,000 acres. Its adjacent temple, Pumapunku, is packed with advanced masonry, each stone above and beyond the skill of cavemen, even latter-day stonemasons. But how can we tell if these temples were built before the flood? The focus of excavations by the archaeologist Arthur Poznański was a quadrangle of monolithic standing stones called the Kala Sasaya. And he noted how the alignment was off by 18 degrees relative to the sun along the horizon. And this is due to the effects of the Earth's rotation and tilt, which causes the stars to appear in a different part of the sky over the course of millennia. It's a phenomenon called precession. So Poznański recalculated the correlation between the stones and the solstices, and his figures were peer-reviewed by a group of mathematicians and deemed to be correct. This massive quadrangle was built, according to Poznański, in 15,000 BC. But there's something else. Relative to its adjacent temples, the Kala Sasaya appears to have been forced to fit a pre-existing plan, because the 3 adjacent sites, the Akapana Mound, the semi-subterranean temple, as well as Pumapunku, are all offset by a further 3 degrees. They reference a very different sky. And given the greater depth of sedimentation, it is likely these 3 sites are even older. It takes the Earth 21,600 years to tilt 3 degrees on its axis. If this correlation is correct, then these 3 sites could be as old as 36,000 BC. And as extreme as this date may sound, there is another link with Egypt here. The Egyptian king list stated in the Turin Papyrus begins around 36,000 BC, a fact that was shared with Greek historians when they visited Egypt over 3,000 years ago. And Poznański himself was also of the opinion that Tiwanaku was built and rebuilt over 3 different stages, with the Akapana, the semi-subterranean temple, and Pumapunku referencing a truly remote era, followed by the Kala Sasaya, and then a rebuilding of the site after it was destroyed by a colossal wall of water that came from the tipping over of Lake Titicaca. The only catastrophe we know that was capable of such destruction was the Great Flood at the end of the Younger Dryas. So who were the gods who built the temple complex of Tiwanaku? And more to the point, who was responsible for its rebuilding? The local Puquinas still teach their oral tradition of having fled to the Andes after a flood sank their island continent in the Pacific, and they call it Lupaquije, also known as Mu'ul, or as it became known, Lemuria. And their story says that the temples were rebuilt after the flood by the godman Viracocha, along with his 7 High Waipanti, which means sages, craftspeople, one of whom was both his wife and sister. Now, interestingly, this is a shared observation all around the world, wherever the gods alighted after the flood. High Waipanti translates as shining ones, the people for whom Tiwanaku was named. These seafaring gods appeared from the Pacific. They were described as very tall, white-skinned, bearded, red-haired, and were associated with the symbol of the serpent. They were also defined by their elongated skulls. Oh, a treasure trove of skulls was found at Paracas on the coast of Peru. and compared to human skulls, these elongated heads have a 25% larger cranial capacity. And although human skulls are known to have been artificially shaped by parents wishing their children to grow up looking like the gods, artificially shaping a skull cannot increase its cubic capacity. And furthermore, the origin of their DNA leads to the region of the Black Sea, the Middle East, and Egypt. So, might Viracocha and his 7 shining ones have been of Egyptian provenance? Edfu, a temple dedicated to the falcon god Horus. Written on its walls are the building texts. They describe how a group of gods called Aku Shemsu Hor began arriving along the Nile after a catastrophe partially sank their homeland, Taneteru, an island somewhere in the region of the Indian Ocean. The event coincides with the incident that caused the Younger Dryas around 10,800 BC. They also had another base, Iutiti, a possible reference to Lake Titicaca and its island of the sun. The Aku Shemsu Hor established a series of sacred mounds along the Nile that became the foundations of future temples. The timing coincides with an anomaly in this region, an agricultural revolution that appeared out of nowhere in the Nile Valley around 10,500 BC. The texts say that within 800 years, a second disaster sank the primeval island of the gods for good, whereupon one group of survivors returned to Egypt. 7 sages led by an 8th, a charismatic leader called Hor. These were the Aku Shemsu Hor, which means shining ones, followers of Horus. Like in other parts of the world, they too are described as between 8.5 to 10 feet tall, light-skinned, with elongated skulls. And just as Viracocha in South America, their stated task was to rebuild the former mansions of the gods. What mansions might they have come to rebuild in Egypt? Oh, I love the building texts. They describe the first appearance of the Shining Ones, the followers of Horus, as the first occasion. And the date is memorialized in the alignment of the pyramids of Giza, the spring equinox of 10,400 BC.